So, as you have been informed, we have made a change in this session. Due to personal reasons, we have to change one of the speakers, but we have an excellent replacement who is here. And now we will start with the presentation of Almaz, a long-time member of BIEN, and coming from the New York University of Shanghai, right? And she's going to present a work with a very interesting, to say the least, title. Everyone a Capitalist, Basic Income and Redistribution.
So today, because this panel was scheduled to be on social protection, I wanted to talk about two approaches to arguing for basic income. One that focuses on social protection, arguments for basic income from social protection, and arguments for basic income focused on redistribution. So we've heard a couple of times during this conference already references to Philippe von Parijs and Robert van der Veen's essay, A Capitalist Road to Communism, which I think is a wonderful metaphor for arguments about basic income. Today I want to make reference to another metaphor that Philippe has given us, which is that basic income is the marriage of justice and efficiency. I think we need to make both kinds of arguments, and I've phrased this in my own way as using both of the R words, reciprocity and redistribution. I call them the R words because reciprocity isn't such a bad word, but certainly where I come from, redistribution is like a four-letter word in the US. So I call those the R words. And I think each approach has its advantages, but they each have their own risks as well. So starting with the reciprocity argument, basic income is often put forward as an improved system of social protection. This is an argument very familiar to people in this room, so I don't want to belabor it. I do want to stress, though, that as we are at the 30th anniversary of the founding of BIEN and the 16th Congress, it's my opinion that many of the general arguments that we need to make about basic income as a better system of social protection have been made. I do think it is time for us to make very country or region-specific arguments about why basic income would be an improvement to the social protection system in our own systems. And my own work is focused on making that case for the United States. So in the United States, I argue that the goal for basic income should be the elimination of absolute poverty. Now, it may seem strange to talk about absolute poverty in one of the richest countries in the world, but we do have a meager government-defined level of poverty, which is roughly $1,000 a month for an adult individual. And we have 15% of the population living under that threshold. We have another 15% living very close to that threshold, so not living in poverty, but living in a state of economic insecurity. And so the goal for a basic income, one goal, not the only goal, but one goal should certainly be to provide that bottom 30% of the American population in the richest country in the world with some basic economic security. Now, of course, in other countries, the goal is going to be different. It might be the elimination of absolute poverty as defined by the United Nations, living on less than $1.25 a day. For others, it might be the elimination of relative poverty, although, of course, relative poverty is a harder thing to eliminate completely if you have any inequality at all. Or it might be the elimination of food insecurity, for example, or some other forms of insecurity. So this approach to arguing for basic income is often critiqued by the left as being too productivist, right, too instrumental. as being about supporting and continuing the system of capitalist exploitation that basic income is meant to address in the first place. I think that there's merits to that critique. It shouldn't be the only argument that we make for basic income, but I do think that we have to meet the people who are skeptical of basic income where they are. And I think for most people in the United States who are skeptical about basic income, the reason they are skeptical about it is because they think it doesn't embody this principle of reciprocity. That yes, we should have a safety net for people whose work does not bring them up to a decent level, to a decent minimum, but they have to make some kind of contributory effort before we're willing to do that. So I think we have to take that argument on and address it. I think we need to talk about how basic income upholds a particular society's notions of either fairness, a concept that I think is a stronger one in the West than it is in the East, or upholds the roles that people are expected to play in their societies. Again, at the risk of a very broad generalization, I think a concept that has more resonance in some Eastern societies, right? The idea that there are roles that we play in society rather than that everything has to be fair on an individualistic basis. There are risks to this argument, to this line of argument, of course. One of the risks is that there could be a perception that in a given society that the system of social protection works pretty well. If we have a social insurance program, we have social assistance programs, we have government-provided healthcare, education, etc., why do we need a basic income? I think that's one of the risks. Fortunately, that's not a risk in the United States because our system of social protection does not work very well. But it also opens the debate up to counter-proposals for other ways to improve the system of social protection. In the United States, this takes the form of arguments for what is called the Swedish model, now becoming supplanted by the new hot thing from the Nordic region, Danish flex security, right, as the answer to the problems of the poor in the United States. Another counter-proposal is guaranteed jobs. We've heard about this at previous BIEN congresses from Phil Harvey, who doesn't seem to be here today, and others. This is another strong argument on the left, in particular in the United States. People don't want money, what they want is jobs. They want the opportunity to be productive members of society. And of course, there's always good old trickle-down economics. All we need to do is grow the economy, and we will all benefit from that. There'll be more jobs created, and people will all be better off. So again, these are the counter-proposals that I think are the most resonant in the United States. Counter-proposals will vary from country to country. We have the answers to all of these challenges, to the superiority of basic income as a system of social protection. We have those answers. We just need to be prepared in the debates to counter them. So we talked a little bit about the Swiss campaign for the basic income referendum, and I think it's important to see what lessons we can learn from the Swiss campaign. I think that this is now, as an outsider, I know a little bit about Switzerland, I've spent a little bit of time there, but from the outside, without having done much of a study of it, it seems to me that it's possible to make the argument that in Switzerland, the system of social protection works very well. Switzerland has a high effective minimum wage. It seems to have, again, from the perspective of the United States at least, excellent education and healthcare. It has very high labor force participation rates, particularly for women, one of the highest in the world. And it seems to have a social contract that balances the interests of the dominant and minority linguistic groups. I sense from Enno Schmidt, who spoke to us at the BIEN Congress in Montreal, that in fact there was a strategic decision on the part of the Swiss campaigners not to emphasize the improvements that basic income would provide over the system of social protection in Switzerland. There was a sense of wanting to emphasize the more transformative aspects, the more playful aspects of what a basic income could do for society. And I don't want to second guess that strategic decision, I also don't think I'm particularly interested in spending a lot of time thinking about whether the Swiss campaign was a success or a failure. We've heard both arguments so far this Congress. I'm more interested in what is it that we can learn, and I think that requires some more detailed study. We heard a little bit from Shay yesterday about some of the demographic differences and support for basic income. I think it would be also helpful to know a little bit more about what some of the content of the debates were, and I look forward to hopefully hearing more about that. Okay, so moving on from the reciprocity arguments to the other R word, to the redistribution argument. And this argument has changed a little bit from when we first heard about it, Marx in the 19th century, through James Mead in the early part of the 20th century, which I'll talk about in a little moment, to Piketty, of course. We've changed our perception of what redistribution means from redistribution of the means of production to redistribution of capital or property. I'll use those terms interchangeably here. All right, well, what are the risks of the redistribution approach? This approach has risks as well. It's very easy to be accused, again, particularly in my home country, in the United States, of class warfare, wanting to incite class warfare, of the politics of envy the rich, or being accused of being a communist, which is about the worst thing that you can be accused of in the United States. And my sense is that we need to rehabilitate this concept of redistribution. And I'm going to offer a suggestion of how. If we want to make the redistribution argument, we need to start with data. And thanks to Thomas Piketty, we have a wealth of data right now. And I think that in everything that I've read about the Piketty book, since its publication, including in the very excellent symposium on Piketty that was published last year in Basic Income Studies, which I encourage you all to read if you haven't already, is there's one thing that I think is not emphasized as much as it needs to be, and that's summarized in this quote here, which I will read for the benefit of translation. In all known societies, at all times, the least wealthy half of the population own virtually nothing, generally little more than 5% of total wealth. The top decile of the wealth hierarchy own a clear majority of what there is to own, generally more than 60% of total wealth, and sometimes as much as 90% of total wealth. And the remainder of the population, by construction, the 40% in the middle, own from 5 to 35% of all wealth. I think that's a truly astonishing piece of data. The bottom 50% of society has never, in any known society, owned more than 5 or 10% of the wealth of society. Just to show you the data on which this is based, this is a table from Piketty's book, and the first column is what he calls a low inequality society. This is only inequality of capital, this is not inequality of income, it's inequality of capital. In a low inequality society, which he says has never been observed, we would expect to see that the bottom 50% would own about 25% of the wealth of society. Why not 50%? Of course, we accept the arguments that defenders of capitalism make all the time, that we need to have some inequality to provide incentives for people to work hard. Right? If we just distribute things equally, then what is the incentive to work? We won't have anything to distribute in the end if we do so. So Piketty suggests that a relatively egalitarian, not equal, but egalitarian society would be one in which the bottom 50% would own about 25% of total wealth. In fact, he says that in the most egalitarian societies we have known, for which we have data, and I should say this is the most egalitarian post-capitalist industrial societies, right? We're not talking about small-scale tribal or hunter-gatherer societies. We're talking about modern industrial societies. The most egalitarian society is, he says, Scandinavia, where despite a higher degree of income equality, Right? Remember, this chart is only talking about capital. Even in Sweden, the bottom 50% of society has never owned more than 10% of the society's wealth. And of course, these other columns here are much scarier. This is Europe in 2010, which he considers median inequality. The bottom 50% owns 5%. High inequality in the United States. Again, the bottom 50% only owns 5%, and very high inequality the same. So it's pretty stable across different kinds of societies that the bottom 50% will own no more than 5% of the total wealth. And of course, this Scandinavian figure is about Scandinavia in the 1970s and 80s. Inequality is increasing in Scandinavia as well. So when we want to make an argument for redistribution, my suggestion is that we focus on the democratic aspects of redistribution. And this is where I bring in James Mead. James Mead was an economist in the early part of the 20th century who took a very, I would say, normatively neutral approach in many ways to describing the problems that he saw. And of course, what he saw was a society that was beginning its, according to Piketty's data, beginning its trajectory into a more egalitarian society than it had been before World War I. But even he saw that eventually the returns to capital were going to outweigh the returns to labor. And he provides what I think is one of the best statements of the argument for why it's important to redistribute not only income, but also capital, which he calls property. Again, I'll read this for purposes of translation. A man with much property has great bargaining strength and a great sense of security, independence, and freedom. And he enjoys these things not only vis-a-vis his propertyless fellow citizens, but also vis-a-vis the public authorities. He can snap his fingers at those on whom he must rely for an income, for he can always live for a time on his capital. The propertyless man must continuously and without interruption acquire his income by working for an employer or by qualifying to receive it from a public authority. An unequal distribution of property means an unequal distribution of power and status, even if it is prevented from causing too unequal a distribution of income. That's from James Mead's book, Liberty, Equality, and Efficiency. So what are some of the ways that we can rehabilitate this idea of redistribution? Well, I think two ways. One way we can do it is pointing to at least two ways in which we take redistribution very much for granted. And we need to bring those arguments to the fore and try to get them to supersede the place of meritocratic inequality in the marketplace. So democracy itself, of course, is a form of redistribution. We don't think about it that way. We take it for granted that in democratic societies, everybody should have the right to vote. But we forget that it took many battles over hundreds of years to secure that right of universal suffrage in the countries that enjoy it now. Not all countries do, of course. And at each step along the way towards universal suffrage, there was a redistribution from some to others. So first from monarchs to landowners, then from property owners to the propertyless, from ethnic majorities to ethnic minorities, and last but not least, from men to women. These are all redistributions of power away from wealthy white men to the rest of us. And we should acknowledge that, and we should highlight that in our conversations. There's nothing wrong with redistribution. We do it every time we go to the ballot box and vote. Having the vote is like having a guaranteed minimum political power, right? It's a guaranteed minimum of political power. It's not political equality. We don't all have equal political voice or vote. We know that very well. The wealthy, the strong, the powerful have stronger voices in public debate. But we do have a guaranteed minimum that is reusable and renewable no matter how badly we spend it in any particular election. All those people who vote for Donald Trump in the upcoming US presidential election will be able to vote again next time, even if they waste their vote, in my humble opinion, on Donald Trump. Another way, I think, to rehabilitate the idea of redistribution is to talk about the redistribution that goes on in the family all the time. Family is a source of unconditional economic security. And we have an intuitive understanding of the need to invest economically in our children, in the next generation, both to ensure their future productivity. That's the instrumental reason, right? The efficient reason to invest in our children. But we also want our children to flourish, to live autonomous lives when they are adults. And that's the ethical reason, the normative reason that we do so. And again, we can point to the fact that in all known societies, women have less capital, less property than men. How can this be a question of merit? Is it really the case that in all societies, men are more merit-worthy than women? Men do more to support society than women? This is just inconceivable that this could possibly be the case. And we need to make that argument. The fact that women are unequal in terms of capital and property ownership is because of the way the rules are set up, not because of anything intrinsic to women or to men. So we need to displace the prioritization of market relations and the way we talk about merit and entitlement in the market with the way we talk about those same things in family relations. I think this is a very important feminist argument for redistribution and for basic income that we also need to emphasize. Finally, I just want to end by talking a little bit about what lessons we might take from Brexit and from the Trump and Sanders campaigns in the United States. We remind ourselves that, of course, the classical political economy, political economic theory of people like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, they actually make no promise that capitalism is a better system for individuals. Right? They don't talk about the distributive effect of capitalism. They talk about capitalism and free trade as the way to increase overall production, to increase the size of the pie. Distribution is completely dependent on public policy, on the laws and the rules and regulations that we set up for property ownership and transfer and accumulation in society. And I think, again, just very superficially, one of the lessons we can take from Brexit is, and from the populist campaigns in the United States in this election cycle, is that 50% at the very least of Brits and Americans feel completely alienated from the lives that are led by the most affluent 50%, who are in favor of global integration, who are in favor of capitalism, who see nothing wrong with the way the system works now. And we need to address them. We need to get them on our side. That's a big number, 50%. Oops. If we had 50% of the Swiss on our side, we would have a basic income in Switzerland right now. So I'll just end by saying that we need to return to and complete the redistributive program of the 20th century, to extend it, in Piketty's terms, to the patrimonial middle class. The patrimonial middle class is the 40% between the bottom 50% and the top 10%. The top 10%, of course, if we go back to that chart, is the part of society that controls most of the resources in society. 50% in Sweden, in Scandinavia in the 70s and 80s, 60% in Europe now, 70% in the US, possibly going as high as 90% in the US in the future. The patrimonial middle class is the next 40%, which controls somewhere around a third of the resources of society. That was the big change over the course of the 20th century. Right at the beginning of the 20th century, the top 10% owned 90% of the resources in society. There wasn't a middle class, right? The rest of society owned 10%. Now the patrimonial middle class has taken some of that from the top 10%, although we're starting to lose it, starting to give it back. We need to change the direction. and move that patrimonial middle class, that property ownership, that capital ownership down into the bottom 50% as well. Which is why I say that what we need to do, and what I think basic income will do, is make everyone a capitalist. Thank you very much.
Inspiring presentation that give us a lot of thought in this debate. Now we will listen to the presentation by John Scott on the basic income and social protection in Mexico. John Scott is coming from the CONEVAL, the National Council for Evaluation of Social Policy in Mexico, an official body of the Mexican state, a peculiar official body because it is in its core, its backbone is composed by researchers, by scholars, distinguished academicians who belong to the national research system. So it's a very particular and important institution innovation in the case of Mexico. And recently, CONEVAL has been talking about basic income. So we are very pleased that John and CONEVAL are participating in this Congress, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great honor to be here. I'm going to speak from CONEVAL, but what the views that I express here are just one of 6 academics, and they're probably not representative completely of CONEVAL. So I'm going to talk about social protection and basic income in Mexico. I think a lot of the discussion of basic income that we've seen here and in many other forums take place in the context of high income and highly developed welfare states. No? I think the case of Mexico is representative of a different type of country with high inequality and weak welfare states. So I think it raises different issues which I think are very interesting for Mexico, but also more broadly for other countries like this. Now, here, in fact, we have the 2 regions, the 2 kind of countries represented in this event, which I very often use as a counterpart for Latin America, which is East Asian, the Korean, a very dynamic but equitable development model, and Europe, the Nordic European countries. And these regions have actually achieved the lowest levels of inequality with very different models, and they certainly pose a contrast as we will see to Latin America. So the context in Mexico is, as Cecilia Soto mentioned yesterday already, historical persistence of inequality and poverty, and extreme poverty. CONEVAL, since CONEVAL's creation in Mexico, will measure poverty in a multidimensional way, and it has 6 dimensions in income. I will show the dimension in a moment, but the 3 dimensions which actually have more weight in explaining why poverty is not going down as fast as it should is income, especially, and social protection or social security, and food security. So 3 measures which are very intimately related to social protection. And secondly, the main issue, status fact about Mexico is that the welfare state, if we can call it like that, is very weak in many ways. No? Very low fiscal capacity. Mexico is one of the lowest non-oil fiscal capacities, that means stable fiscal capacities. Very limited and unequal social protection system. We will see it's a dual, highly structured system where a part of the population is protected by fairly generous, comparatively, social security systems designed not so much on the beverage model to provide a basic floor, but more on a model to provide replacement income for a small group of people. And then we have most of the rest of the population, which is either uninsured or covered by very basic, non-contributory programs. And we will see that also administrative and institutional capacities are weak. So the way I'm going to use basic income here is as a kind of model or as a normative reference point for the idea of social protection reform. And there, I would argue that a lot of the talk of basic income that we see is very provocative and very revolutionary, and that actually makes it more difficult to sell or to communicate to a wider audience. What I'm going to try to emphasize here is how the concept of basic income is really very similar to many very common parts or components of a universal basic social protection scheme. No? I think the way many others have emphasized, like Tony Atkinson, probably more an economist rather than a more philosophical perspective. Fortunately, we've seen very diverse, I've never seen so diverse disciplinary perspectives as in a forum like this, which is, I think, very good news. So, I'm going to tell you 4 points, basically. Reforming the way the idea of the basic, or the concept of basic income allows us to reform other instruments which are very common and are certainly, even though the idea of basic income doesn't seem like a very efficient redistributive instrument, it's not targeted, we will see that it's extremely efficient in comparison to the way many countries spend a lot of the money. In particular, there are consumer subsidies, subsidies to contributory social security in Mexico. Even though social security is contributory, it is heavily subsidized, and those subsidies go to the upper income groups because they are the ones who are in the formal population who can pay the cost of the contribution. So you pay the contribution, and then you get the subsidies, in a way. And those subsidies happen for many reasons. One, some are temporary because the system is being reformed into individualized accounts, but the reform will take a few 100 years to be implemented completely. For the last process to actually transfer to the new system and stop being subsidized. And also there are other systems which are not reformed and which are therefore and which are underfinanced by contributions, so they are subsidized by the general population, and they are very often very privileged systems involving public sector workers and public sector companies. Secondly, there's an issue of targeting, which is well known. There are limits to administrative targeting, exclusion errors, and targeting costs. Then something which is, I think, also very well known, but is very interesting in the context of high inequality countries like Mexico, is that one of the simplest fiscal systems which we can conceive theoretically, which is a basic income with a flat tax, is extremely redistributive in this context. First, because a flat tax in a country, we assume that a flat tax is very efficient in terms not of equity, but of raising resources. It's very relevant in this context because in a high inequality, it's very easy to show that in a high inequality country, making the tax system progressive at the cost of making it a bit less efficient in terms of raising money is a very bad idea. It's a much better idea to raise as much money that you can through the tax system and then to spend it progressively rather than to try to make the tax system itself progressive. That can be shown very easily when we show it. And then finally, the idea of basic income over the life cycle. A lot of there are a lot of basic incomes in specific points, critical points in the life cycle, child benefits, universal pensions. In the case of countries like Mexico, Brazil, South Africa, and many other Latin American countries, the main basic income component which you find is pensions, universal pensions. Very recently, in the case of Mexico, and in the case of most other countries, But you don't see that for other phases. You don't see that for child benefits even, and you certainly don't see it for working age adults. And I would argue that once society is in favor of a basic universal pension, it's very inconsistent not to be in favor of a more general basic income, because the other groups are, if anything, this will sound very controversial, the economic and ethical arguments for child benefit or even working age, the population having a basic income are even stronger than in the case of old age pension. I'm not suggesting that old age pension shouldn't be, but I'm saying that. So this is the way CONEVAL measures poverty. No, we have two spaces, as it were. We have 6 social rights, basically, which are education, health, social security, housing, basic services, and access to food security. And we have income in the vertical. And basically, you are poor if you have at least one of these social rights not fulfilled, and if you are under the moderate, as it were, poverty line, no? Which we call well-being line. And you're extremely poor if you are under an extreme poverty line, which is basically a food basket, and if you have at the same time 3 or more social rights which are not fulfilled. So as you can see, it's a mixture of an income and a non-income, a social gap poverty. If you are, the other spaces include people who are poor in terms of dimensions, or poor in terms of income only. And the policy should aim really at people who are not poor either or not vulnerable in terms of social dimensions, and also not vulnerable in terms of income. So that's the conception. No? The idea, why this poverty measure? Well, the idea is that this is a poverty measure which is much better aligned to public policy. It not only recognizes rights and income as 2 different conceptually welfare notions or well-being notions. It's also very practical in terms of directing anti-poverty policy or directing social policy in general. You can see how it's working in each dimension. These are the numbers, the most recent numbers. We will announce, by the way, in a month, CONEVAL will announce the 2015 numbers. Yeah, no, I think right. Thank you. So, well, if you see over time, one thing which will be extremely surprising to people from Korea is that income poverty has not declined, has been very stable over a very long period of time. And you can actually go back to the 70s, and you will find this line continuous. So we have had about almost half a century of very little advance in extreme income poverty. A lot of advance we will see in rights, in social rights, but not in income. And that reflects the fact that Mexico has grown little, and the little growth that we have had has actually not impacted salaries, and least of all low income and skilled salaries. So that's a challenge. No? Then we have very important advances in some of the dimensions for the complications, but I just wanted to see that a big dimension where there's been very little advance is access to social security. This reflects this dual system where most of the population, this is people who lack, so 60% of the people lack access to social security. So both the contributory social security systems plus the non-contributory programs like basic pensions leave out 60% of the population still now. And also food security has also been very flat. Fortunately, access to health has been advanced very well. Education, housing services, there's been a lot of problems in other dimensions. This is very unfortunate because it was a very beautiful graph. It was a graph showing concentration coefficients of social spending in Mexico, of different programs. And what you saw was that a lot of the programs were in this part, in this very unequal part, so they were not pro-poor. They were not even neutral, but they were pro-not poor, not exactly pro-rich as well, but they were not very well targeted. Most of social spending in Mexico is like that, and I mean the contributive social security, subsidies to that, not the parts which is where each worker funds its own benefits, but the part where the fiscal system funds the subsidies. Consumer subsidies, which is basically energy subsidies, and also food and medicine exemptions of VAT, which sounds very pro-poor, but they are not. In a high inequality country, they are concentrated, the benefits concentrated on the non-poor, because consumption, of course, is distributed as in proportion to income. What else? Higher education, tertiary education, basically those are the things which are not for poor. And then we have some things which are very poor, which are targeted transfers, but which you would have seen here, the mass is smaller. So the overall spending, sorry for that fact, if you see just targeted transfers, the story looks very good. These are income deciles, so 1 is the lowest, the poorest 10%, 10 is the richest 10%. Doesn't matter the scale, but this is a measure of the absolute distribution. And then if we add, however, other transfers, which include these subsidies to social security plus general consumer subsidies, we see that the distribution changes dramatically because these are not for poor and these are much larger. So the full effect of the monetary transfers is very repressive in absolute terms. It's very important to remember the absolute relative difference. In relative terms, this is still redistributive because income distribution is so unequal in Mexico that this income represents a larger share for the poor than this income for the rich. But still, in absolute terms, very repressive. If you add in-kind benefits, education and health spending, without the transfers we just saw, the regressive transfers we just saw, you have a very progressive distribution. 30% gets to the lowest income decile. It's not extremely progressive, but it's certainly progressive. Once you add these subsidies, this becomes very flat and even regressive. No? There's slightly a higher concentration of total social transfers, total redistributed spending in Mexico towards the higher end. And this might seem very exceptional, but it's actually very typical. No? If you see, these are concentration on Lawrence curves for these countries in Latin America, and you can see for the whole social spending, basically for education and health income spending plus monetary transfers, and as you can see they're very flat. That means they're very close to the diagonal. No? That means that the poorest 10% gets about 10%, the richest 10% gets about 10%. Okay? They are still redistributive because, as I said, in relative terms, they certainly, the 10% that the poorest get means much more than the 10% that the richest get, because the 10% poorest in Mexico is closer to 1% of the national income distribution, while the richest 10% has about 40%. Okay? Which is clear, no? What's the potential of a basic income to eliminate extreme poverty in Mexico? Well, as we saw, it has a lot of potential first in terms of eliminating the exercise that we saw with seen mentioned for our country. It offers the idea of eliminating the income poverty for all. It offers obviously the idea of universal access to social security and also access to food. It can also be defended, as I said, as a way to substitute this progressive, this
regressive transfers towards a more progressive distribution, which I mentioned, let me illustrate here. This is the absolute distribution of targeted transfers in Mexico. This is the absolute distribution of the general subsidies, and this, of course, would be basic income. So what would happen if, instead of this distribution, you apply these resources to basic income? Well, this would be the relative distribution of the incidence. No? You see that even though certainly the targeted is much more pro-poor, it represents 73% of the income of the poor decile. If we just change from the general but progressive subsidies to the untargeted basic income, we go from 5% to 25% or 20% of income. We multiply the impact of these resources on the poor 5 times, no? Or 4 times. So it has a lot of redistribution potential if you compare it to the instruments we actually use for most of the money. No? Certainly not if you compare it to Progresa, to Prospera, which is a conditional cash transfer, but we will see that there are other advantages in relation to that. Well, this is just to illustrate the extreme differences in public spending in Mexico, horizontal differences between the different social protection systems. No? We have a lot of, like 60% of the population has either no protection at all. We are talking here, these are pensions and this is health, or very little protection, basically less than a poverty line of protection. And then we have the rest, which has systems which go from 8 times to 120 times, not percent, times. That's the order of magnitude. The level of subsidy which is given to the basic non-contributive population. So these are not, these numbers do not include the finance which has to do with contributions which you make for your own future. They have to do only with subsidies which are paid by general taxation. So we see extreme inequalities. Somehow the country treats a Mexican in this part of the distribution with someone and a Mexican in this part of the distribution with something between 8 and 132 times. Why? Well, because the way Social Security was designed, the way a lot of the benefits in the public sector were captured, before Mexico really had very functional democratic institutions, these were negotiations done in a, certainly not in a Swiss kind of referendum, but they survived, and they are considered labor rights which should be respected, but that's the reality of the contrast. And if we see, the problem is that the subsidies are growing exponentially because of reforms or unreformed systems, while this is the proportion that you see, the non-contributory pensions are here. And this is if we add all other transfers which are, especially the CCT conditional and cash transfers. So we see a lot of inequality and also a lot of stability. In contrast, for example, this is the trend that a new universal pension system would have in Mexico, which is not clear how much it was a proposal of the current administration. It's not clear how much it is being implemented, but it would increase, basically it would offer all the old age population a poverty line in a certain period. Basically, it would increase to the basic cost of the poverty line at the starting year. And if you see there's a proportion of GDP, even though the old age population obviously in Mexico will grow, if Mexico grows at even at a modest rate, which for us is very high, of 3%, then this will go down because it's an absolute poverty line, not a relative poverty line. So it's very sustainable. So what are the advantages in terms of targeting? It minimizes disincentives. We know that this public certainly knows very well about that. It also, well, one thing which makes it very counterintuitive is that
it seems to have a very costly inclusionary. No? If you see it not in terms of in a philosophical way of general rights, but it's a way of lowering poverty. The cost of giving this transfer to everybody, it seems very inefficient. But of course, if you tax it, if you consider basic income taxable income, then you take it back. The system takes it back from the non-poor in theory. And basically, the main argument in favor of basic income in a country like Mexico is that it's the only way to actually ensure that you have no exclusionary. There's no other way. No, there's no. We have a very good administrative targeted program, which is the Prospera CCT program. We have had it for a couple of decades. Very efficiently targeted, but still it has a fairly significant exclusionary. And finally, well, this is what I just mentioned. As I mentioned, let me just show you the very simple mathematics of redistribution in a very high inequality country, which are very counterintuitive, maybe. Given that the poorest income decile in Mexico is about 1% of national income, a flat tax of 10% to finance and basic income would basically double the income of the poorest decile. Why? Because the poorest decile would pay 10% of its income, but receive almost 1%, not almost 1% of GDP, of national income, so would receive 0.9%, which doubles, given its very small share of market income, it doubles its income. So this very, apparently not very targeted combination, which is a flat tax with a basic income, is highly redistributed in these high inequality conditions. Okay? Well, I think something, it's very important to show this, but it's very controversial here, but that the basic income concept is not as exotic as it seems. Certainly for this audience, perhaps it doesn't sound so exotic for most audiences. The literal concept of very basic income, despite the Swiss referendum, and in part, perhaps because it had some, I think it had ambiguous consequences, but we can talk about that later, has an exotic element. I think it's extremely important to show that it's actually very common in universal, inclusive public policy designs. It's obviously consistent with the concept of social rights, with optimal tax theory in economics. This especially is very good book by Tony Atkinson, with the beverage model versus the Bismarck model of social policy, which actually is the main, it dominates a lot in most OECD countries in core elements, and with the, you cannot see it here, but with the idea which is very important for Mexico, which is a common natural resource which is owned by the population in here, all. No? And I will end with this. Well, I will end with two things. One is the idea of why a basic income, once you accept, once society accepts the idea of a basic income for all the population, in a country like Mexico, there's a very strong case to accept it more generally. In the case of child benefits, I think I don't have to argue it. It's both ethically and economically extremely important. But even in the case of the working age population, in Mexico, most of the working poor are not poor because they are not working voluntarily, or not even because they are unemployed. They are poor because they have very low levels of productivity, because they have low levels of assets, opportunities to use those assets. They are asset poor. And they are not asset poor because they choose to be, because they don't go to the bank to get a credit to accumulate assets, but because they face a lot of restrictions. So in that scenario, certainly if you compare somebody like that with, for example, somebody which reaches old age, who had the opportunities to save but didn't save, it's not clear that the ethical ground is in favor of the older population. So again, I'm not saying that you should take away those pensions. I'm saying that there's a very strong ground for a more general basic income. Yes, I'm finished. So let me end with the is it feasible? This is the last point. Would it be feasible for Mexico
to have a basic income of this time. Well,
First note that Mexico, as I mentioned, is a very, very low fiscal capacity, surprisingly low. Historically, about 10%. We have not surpassed 10% of non-oil fiscal capacity, in part precisely because we have had oil. It has not been necessary. It has not been politically easy to have the relevant
fiscal reforms, because we have the oil, but the oil is ending. So what would be the sources of finance? And how much would it cost? And what would be the constraints? I would be extremely brief. These are 4 different concepts, no, of what it would cost. This is really a theoretical concept, which is interesting. If you could perfectly identify the poor and also how poor they are, so the poverty gap, and you would have the institutional capacity to actually transfer individualized poverty gaps, then you could end poverty in Mexico with about 0.68% of GDP, income poverty. Still cheap. So the problem of poverty is theoretically is not resources, but information and institutional capacity. Obviously, this is completely out of the possibilities of any country. A second thing is, if you cannot identify the poor precisely, you can identify the poor, but not the poverty gaps, and you transfer only to the poor the basic income, then it will still be fairly cheap. How about a basic income, which you don't target? Then it would go to, if you only transfer the mean poverty gap, which is about 40% maybe in Mexico, then this is what you would get, 2.4%. If you transfer the whole poverty line, no, which is the only way you can really be completely sure that no poor will remain, that would cost more or less 6% of GDP, applying equivalent scales and using CONEVAL's poverty line. So 6% is very high for Mexico. If you take into account 10% non-oil fiscal capacities, what could be well, this is consistent with spending in Mexico on target program, but of course, given that you cannot actually reach this, you don't have instruments to make this simplification, it's really just a theoretical equivalence. Some sources of finance are energy subsidies, about 1% of GDP, energy fiscal expenditure, which is what we would get if we apply the green tax in Mexico, an optimal green tax. VAT fiscal expenditures, this generally is subsidies through VAT expenditures, 2%. Contribute to social security, subsidies, 3%. And the oil rate, no? Oil is, if I finish, now I promise I will finish with this. Oil is a very interesting form of finance, in the sense that, let me finish with this graph. This is Mexico's, well, I don't know what the graphs don't translate, but this is my last slide. Mexico's oil curve, no? If you think about it, the way oil finances public spending in Mexico and many other countries, where oil, in the case of Mexico, is constitutionally established as owned by the people, as it were. So that means basically that it's as though the government or the state granted their oil rights to the people and then extracted it through the tax system and used it to finance public spending. In that sense, oil financing is like a reverse basic income. It's like a poll tax. That's what it's called, where you charge the same amount to everybody, an extreme poor and extreme rich, which is their oil rent allotment. So in that sense, it's an extremely unequal way of financing income, and it would be a very natural way of financing a basic income. Of course, given that Mexico now finances a lot of educational and health services with this, you would have to only use part of that, but still, no, that's an interesting. Sorry for that.
Well, thank you very much to John for